Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Deku was Amy Rose and Sonic's son and had Belle the Tinkerer as girlfriend? Subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description, so let's begin the story. The village of Emerald Hollow did not appear on any map. It had been built that way on purpose, tucked into a fold of land where the rolling green hills of the old Sonic territories crumbled into the broken, ivy-choked towers of what had once been a hero academy. Nobody remembered the academy's real name anymore. The villagers just called it the ruins, and they told their children not to play there, not because it was haunted, but because the old training arenas still had live defense wards buried in the earth, forgotten but not disarmed, humming to themselves in the dark like sleeping animals. Emerald Hollow existed in the space between two worlds that no longer quite understood each other. It was a place for people who didn't fit the story anymore. Retired speedsters who had outrun their own legends, quirk users too strange or too dangerous for the cities, engineers who built things nobody had asked for, and everybody eventually needed. It had exactly one bakery, one general store that sold suspiciously good soldering irons, and a population that changed its number depending on who was hiding from whom that particular season. And it had, at its northern edge, half swallowed by a stand of ancient sycamore trees, a house with green shutters and a chimney that smoked most mornings, where a boy named Izuku Midoriya was, at that very moment, trying very hard not to destroy his own bedroom. He sat cross-legged on his bed, hands pressed flat against his knees, eyes screwed shut, breathing in long counts of 4 the way his mother had taught him. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Under his palms he could feel it, that low thrum, that impossible pressure that lived somewhere between his heartbeat and the marrow of his bones, like a hell breath that had never once, in 15 years, been allowed to fully release. The lamp on his desk was rattling. He hadn't touched it. He never had to touch anything for this to happen. In for 4. The rattling stopped. Izuku opened his eyes slowly, the way you'd open them after a nightmare when you weren't sure yet whether the monster was gone. The lamp sat still. The floorboards had stopped their faint vibration. A single hairline crack had appeared in the ceiling plaster directly above his head, new, thin as a thread, branching out from the old ones like a spider web slowly being rebuilt one bad night at a time. He let his breath out all at once, and it came out shakier than he wanted it to. Sorry, he muttered to the room, to the crack, to nobody. He said it out of habit more than anything. There was nobody there to hear it except the house itself, which had absorbed more of his apologies over the years than any single structure probably should. Down the hall, he heard the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of his mother's slippers moving fast, and he closed his eyes again, bracing. Izuku? Amy Rose's voice came through the door a half-second before she did, because knocking had never really been her strong suit when she was worried, and she was always at least a little bit worried these days. She pushed the door open, pink hair still in its sleep-tousled bun, eyes already doing the fast sweep of the room, walls, ceiling, floor, him, that she did every single time, cataloging the damage before she'd even said good morning. I'm fine, Izuku said quickly. It was small. I caught it. Amy's eyes found the crack in the ceiling and lingered there a beat too long. That's news, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It never was, not really. But Izuku heard the weight underneath it anyway. The way you hear weight under floorboards that are about to give. It's just plaster, Mom. I know. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, and up close he could see the tiredness under her eyes that hadn't fully gone away even after a full night's sleep, the kind of tired that came from years of it rather than one bad night. She reached out and brushed a strand of unruly green hair off his forehead, an old habit neither of them had ever bothered to break. Bad dream? Same one. He didn't need to say which one. There was only really one dream that mattered, the one that had been recurring since he was old enough to understand what he'd actually done. The one where he was very small and very angry and the mountain in front of their old house came apart like wet paper, and there was screaming. And it took him years to understand that some of the screaming had been his mother's name for him, over and over. Izuku, Izuku, stop, please stop. Except 2-year-olds don't stop. 2-year-olds don't know how. He'd been told the story so many times it had stopped feeling like his own memory, and started feeling like something that had happened to a stranger he was forced to share a body with. You didn't hurt anything, Amy said the way she always said it, gentle and certain, like she could will it into being retroactively true just by saying it enough times. The house is still standing. You're safe. I'm right here. I know. He did know. Knowing didn't make the thrum under his ribs go away. Amy studied him for a moment, and Izuku recognized the look, the one where she was deciding how much of the truth to let out today, like turning a valve just slightly, just enough to keep the pressure from building somewhere else. It was a look he'd grown up watching his whole life, on her face and on his father's, the careful rationing of information they thought he wasn't old enough for, or strong enough for, and this was the thought that always made something bitter curl up in his chest, stable enough for. Breakfast's almost ready, she said instead, standing, smoothing her sleek shirt down with brisk efficiency, already halfway back to the version of herself that ran the house like a small, loving, slightly chaotic military operation. Your dad's making those ridiculous 3-layer pancakes again, so brace yourself for the syrup crisis. There's always a syrup crisis. There's always a syrup crisis, she agreed, and for just a second the tiredness in her face cracked into something warmer, something like the girl she must have been once, 15+ years and one impossible sun ago, before she'd learned to sleep with one ear listening for the sound of her house coming apart. Come down when you're ready, sweetheart. Take your time. She left. Izuku sat a moment longer, looking at the crack in the ceiling, and thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that take your time was a strange thing to say to someone who could, if he ever really let himself go, move faster than sound. Breakfast, as promised, involved pancakes stacked in architecturally unwise towers, a syrup bottle that Sonic the Hedgehog defended with the seriousness of a man guarding state secrets, and roughly 4 minutes of peace before the day's first crisis, which arrived, as it often did, in the form of a knock at the door. Sonic was up and across the kitchen before the second knock landed. He didn't so much walk as arrive, the air behind him stirring the curtains slightly, a habit so old and so constant that Izuku had genuinely never seen his father cross a room at what most people would call a normal human pace. He opened the door to reveal Tails standing on the porch, fox ears pinned back with the particular tension of someone who has run all the way from somewhere, and is trying very hard to look casual about it. Morning, Tails said, a little too brightly. Sorry, is this a bad time? It's never a bad time, Sonic said, already reading his old friend's face the way you read weather. What's wrong? Tails glanced past him, into the kitchen, to where Izuku sat very still at the table with a fork halfway to his mouth, doing an extremely poor job of pretending he wasn't listening. Can we talk outside? Tails said. Izuku set the fork down. He knew that phrase. He'd heard it his whole life. Can we talk outside? Always delivered with the same careful lightness, always followed by his parents disappearing onto the porch or into the yard for a conversation he was never quite allowed to be part of, always returning with faces arranged into the specific calm that adults use on children they've decided need protecting from something. It used to make him feel young. Now, at 15, it mostly just made him feel managed. Amy caught his eye across the table and gave him a small, apologetic smile, the kind that meant I know, I'm sorry, just wait here. And then she was up too, following Sonic and Tails out onto the porch, the door easing shut behind them with a soft click that felt, to Izuku, louder than any explosion he'd ever accidentally caused. He counted to 10. Then he got up, crossed to the window over the sink, and cracked it open half an inch, an old trick he'd perfected years ago. Another sighting near the old academy grounds, Tails was saying, voice pitched low. Chaos signature, definitely not natural. Rouge picked it up on her scans 2 nights ago, and I confirmed it yesterday. It's faint, but it's there, and it's got that same corrupted read we saw 8 years ago. There was a silence on the porch that Izuku could feel through the wall. You're sure, Sonic said. His voice had lost every trace of its usual easy warmth. I wish I wasn't, the order Amy said. Not a question, maybe. Maybe just scavengers picking through old order tech, could be nothing. Tails didn't sound like he believed that. But if it's them regrouping, if they found a way to track, he doesn't need to hear this, Sonic cut in, quieter now, quiet in the specific way that meant he remembered the kitchen window existed. Not yet. Not until we know more. Sonic, Amy started. I mean it, Ames. He's already got enough to carry. Let us handle this first. Please, Izuku eased the window shut, very slowly, and stood at the sink for a long moment with his hands braced against the cool ceramic edge, staring at nothing. He doesn't need to hear this. 15 years old, and he still didn't get to hear the things that were, by any reasonable measure, about him. About the thing that lived in his chest and cracked ceilings and had, once, when he was too small to control anything, taken half a mountain down like it was made of sugar. Whatever this order was, whatever they wanted, it clearly circled back to whatever he was, and he was, once again, the last person in the house allowed to know. He went back to the table, sat down, and finished his pancakes in silence, and when his parents came back in a few minutes later wearing their practiced, unbothered faces, he smiled at them and said everything was great and didn't mention that the window had been open the whole time. He'd gotten very good, over the years, at pretending not to know things. It was, in its own strange way, its own kind of power, quieter than the other one, but his own. He left the house an hour later, telling his mother he was going for a walk to clear his head, which was true, if incomplete. What he didn't say was that clearing his head these days had a very specific destination, and that destination was down the winding dirt path past the old well, through the stand of birches that marked the unofficial edge of the village proper, to a squat, sprawling workshop built half into a hillside, its corrugated roof bristling with antenna and half-finished contraptions, and, this week, what looked suspiciously like a small satellite dish angled at nothing in particular. A hand-painted sign hung crookedly by the door. It read, in looping, slightly too large letters, Belle's Workshop, knock first, sparks possible. Izuku didn't knock. He never did anymore, not since the third time he'd walked in on Belle mid-repair with her chest panel open and half her internal wiring exposed to the air like a surgery in progress, and she'd looked up at him with her single-functioning optical sensor glowing bright with mild annoyance, and said, "If you're going to keep barging in, you may as well hand me a screwdriver." That had been almost 2 years ago. He'd been handing her screwdrivers ever since. He pushed the door open. The workshop smelled the way it always did. Hot solder, machine oil, the faint ozone tang of something being charged that probably shouldn't be charged indoors. And somewhere in the organized chaos of workbenches and hanging tools and shelves stacked 3 deep with salvaged chaos tech, a familiar voice called out without looking up, "You're early." Bad night? Belle the Tinkerer sat hunched over her main workbench, one eye, the good one, the mechanical iris one that whirred faintly when it focused, narrowed at a circuit board she was soldering with a precision that made Izuku's clumsy hands feel like blunt instruments by comparison. Her chassis was slight, built along lines that were more practical than decorative, all soft curves of salvaged plating painted a faded, warm gold that had once probably been much brighter. A single long braid of woven copper wire, more decorative than functional, hung over one shoulder, her one true vanity, she'd once admitted, an aesthetic touch she'd given herself years after her creator had built the rest of her with only survival in mind. "How'd you know?" Izuku asked, dropping his bag by the door and crossing to lean against the edge of her workbench. "Ceiling," Belle said simply, still not looking up. "You get a specific look after you crack the ceiling. Sort of a hunted rabbit thing happening around the eyes." It was one crack. Small one. She set the soldering iron down, finally glancing up at him properly, and something in her expression, even built from servos and salvaged plating, Belle's face had never once failed to be expressive, an old mystery of her design nobody had ever fully explained to Izuku's satisfaction, softened. "You want to talk about it, or you want me to just hand you the parts bin and let you build something until you feel like a person again?" "Parts bin," Izuku said, with real feeling, and Belle's mouth, a fine, articulated seam of plating that moved with startling naturalness, curved upward. "Thought so." She nudged a battered metal bin toward him with one foot without looking, the kind of casual, practiced motion that came from 2 years of exactly this routine. "There's a busted comm relay in there," Rouge dropped off. "See if you can figure out why it keeps dying after 30 seconds of use." "I've got theories, but I want to see if you land on the same one." It was, Izuku understood, had understood for a long time now, in the specific unspoken way you understand things about people you're close to. A kindness disguised as a chore. Belle didn't actually need his help figuring out the relay. She could have had it diagnosed and fixed in the time it took him to find the right screwdriver. What she was actually offering him was somewhere to put his hands and his mind that wasn't the thrum in his chest or the conversation he wasn't supposed to have overheard, and he took it, gratefully, the way he always did. They worked in comfortable quiet for a while, the workshop filled with the small sounds of tools and Belle's occasional hummed fragments of some tune that predated even her, something she said she'd found in an old audio file and never learned the name of. Izuku liked these silences. He'd spent so much of his life around people who filled every quiet moment with careful, managed conversation, watching him, weighing what to say, and Belle just let him be, let the silence stretch as long as it needed to, trusted that he'd talk when he was ready and didn't push if he wasn't. Tails came by the house this morning, he said, eventually, not looking up from the relay's guts. Him and my dad and mom went to talk on the porch. You know. Outside. Belle didn't ask what that meant. She already knew the shorthand, same as he did. Catch anything? Chaos signature near the old academy ruins. Corrupted read, whatever that means. Rouge picked it up 2 nights ago. He turned a tiny circuit chip over in his fingers, watching light catch on its surface. Sounded like they think it might be the order. Regrouping, or scavenging, or I don't know. Dad shut the conversation down before I could hear more. Something crossed Belle's face at that. Quick, there and gone. But Izuku had learned to read her expressions the way he'd learned to read the weight in his mother's voice. And this one he recognized. It was the specific stillness that came over her whenever the word order got said out loud in her presence. Belle? It's fine, she said, a half-second too fast. You went quiet. I go quiet a lot. Occupational hazard of being built with a processor instead of a mouth filter. But her hands had stopped moving over the circuit board, and after a moment she set her tools down properly, the way she did when she decided a thing deserved her full attention instead of the fraction she usually spared while multitasking. It's just, that name still does something to my system, old wiring I guess. Some things don't get better with age, they just get better hidden. Izuku knew, in broad strokes, what she meant. He knew that Belle had not always been the only version of herself. That somewhere in her memory banks she rarely opened. Even for him, there existed the record of a creator who had built her not as a hobby or a curiosity but out of necessity, in secret. In the last stretch of a life that the Eclipse Order had ultimately cut short, he knew that whatever the Order was to his family, a threat, a shadow, a reason for careful porch conversations, it was something far more personal to Belle. A grief with a proper name attached to it. He set the relay down and looked at her properly. You don't have to talk about it, he said. But if you want to, I'm listening. I mean it. Belle looked at him for a long moment, that mechanical eye whirring softly as it focused. The good eye doing whatever the equivalent of studying someone's face was for a person built from circuitry and salvage. And something in her posture eased, just slightly, the particular tension she carried around this one topic loosening a fraction under the weight of being asked gently instead of pried at. Maybe someday, she said. Not today. Today feels like a parts-bin day for both of us, I think. Deal, Izuku said, and meant it, and went back to the relay. And if his hand brushed hers reaching for the same tool a moment later, and neither of them moved away from it right away, that was simply how these afternoons tended to go, and had gone, for the better part of 2 years now, and neither of them had ever quite found the nerve to call it anything more than what it already, unmistakably, was. They fixed the relay. The fault turned out to be a hairline fracture in a power coupling, exactly the theory Belle had been holding in reserve, and she looked entirely too smug about being right for someone who'd basically already known the answer before he'd walked in the door. And then, because it was still early and the sun outside had that particular golden slant that made staying indoors feel like a small tragedy, Belle powered down her workbench array and announced, with the air of someone delivering excellent and non-negotiable news, that they were going outside. You've been cooped up in your own head all morning, she said, already pulling a light travel cloak off its hook by the door, the one she wore less for warmth. Her internal systems ran their own steady climate regardless, and more because she liked the way it moved. Fresh air. Non-negotiable. I'm the doctor here. You're not a doctor. I fix broken things for a living. That's basically the same job. Outside, the day had warmed into something bright and easy. Sunlight filtering gold-green through the birch leaves, the whole hillside humming faintly with the sound of insects, and the distant creak of the village's one working windmill. Izuku felt something in his chest loosen almost immediately, the low thrum easing back a notch the way it usually did once he was moving, once his body had something to do besides sit still and contain itself. "Race you to the ridge," he said, already grinning, already feeling the old itch under his skin. Belle's optical sensor narrowed in the specific way that meant she was calculating odds and had already decided she didn't like them. "You have your father's legs. I have a top speed roughly comparable to an enthusiastic jog. I'll go slow. You say that every time and then you don't." "I promise," Izuku said, holding up both hands in mock solemnity. And Belle gave him a look that said she believed him about as much as she believed in luck, which was to say, not remotely. But she set off toward the ridge at a brisk pace anyway, and he fell into step beside her, deliberately, effortfully slow, the way you hold a sprinting dog back on a leash. It was, he thought, not for the first time, one of the strange gifts of Belle's company, that she was one of the only people in his life who never once flinched when the ground trembled slightly under a burst of his energy, never once got that careful, managing look in her eyes that his parents wore like a second skin. She told him once, early on, in that blunt way she had of saying true things without patting them in kindness first, that she found it difficult to be afraid of power, specifically, having watched what real cruelty without any power at all had done to people she'd loved. Power wasn't the dangerous part, she'd said. Power was just power. What mattered was who was holding it, and why. He thought about that a lot, in the 2 years since. They reached the ridge, a long grassy spine of hill that looked out over the whole valley, the crumbling towers of the old academy just visible in the distance, wreathed faintly in the low haze of morning, and sat down together in the grass, close enough that their shoulders touched, the kind of casual closeness that had crept into their friendship so slowly, and so naturally that Izuku honestly couldn't have named the exact day it started. "You ever think about it?" Izuku asked, after a while, looking out at the ruins. "What it would have been like if things were different. If I'd actually gone to a school like that." Belle followed his gaze. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I think about whether it would have been good for you, or just good for everyone else's peace of mind." "What's the difference?" "Everything," she said simply. "A school like that teaches you to be a hero the way they need heroes to be. Controlled. Predictable. Useful in the shapes they've already decided are useful. That's not the same thing as helping you actually understand what you are." She glanced sideways at him. "You already have people trying to keep you small and safe, Izuku. I don't think you were missing an institution for that." He huffed out something that was almost a laugh. "You make it sound like I dodged a bullet. Maybe you did. Or maybe you got cheated out of something that could have been good. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't tell you which. I just know the version of you sitting next to me right now isn't broken for having grown up outside their walls. Whatever else is true, that part isn't." Izuku looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he sometimes let himself do when he thought she wasn't paying attention, though she almost always was, at the careful, deliberate craftsmanship of her, at the small dent along her jaw that she'd never bothered to fully smooth out because she said it reminded her that she'd survived something, at the copper braid catching the light. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For what?" "For never once looking at me like I'm a problem to be managed." Belle's expression did something complicated then, something that might, on a human face, have been the precursor to tears, though Izuku had genuinely never been sure whether Belle's systems were capable of actual crying or whether the wet shine that sometimes crossed her optical sensor was purely cosmetic, an inherited quirk of design he'd never asked about, and she'd never explained. "You're not a problem," she said very steadily, like she needed him to hear it structured exactly that way, no hedging, no softening. "You're a person who was handed something enormous before he was old enough to understand it, and everyone around you got so scared of the size of it that they forgot to actually teach you what to do with it. That's not the same thing as being broken, Izuku. It's not even close." Something in his chest, not the thrum, something else, something warmer, eased at that, the way it always did when Belle said things like this, plainly, without flourish, like they were simple facts rather than comfort offered out of kindness. "You always know exactly what to say," he murmured. "I have excellent processing speed," Belle said, deadpan, and the moment cracked open into something lighter, both of them laughing, and Izuku bumped his shoulder against hers, and she bumped it right back, harder than he expected, nearly toppling him sideways into the grass, and for a little while, a good, uncomplicated while, the ruins in the distance, and the porch conversation he wasn't supposed to have heard and the cracks spreading slowly across his bedroom ceiling all felt very far away. It didn't last, of course. Nothing ever quite did. But he'd take these while they came. They walked back toward the village as the afternoon began sliding toward evening, and it was on that walk, cutting along the edge of the birch stand, taking the long way because either of them had been in a hurry to end the day, that Izuku first felt it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even really a sound at all, not in the way most people would describe hearing something. It was more like a pressure change, a wrongness in the air, the same way you can sometimes feel a storm coming before a single cloud has appeared, an instinct buried somewhere below conscious thought. He stopped walking. Belle noticed immediately. She always did, some fine-tuned sensor array of hers apparently calibrated specifically to the subtleties of his moods, and stopped a step later, turning back toward him with her optical sensor already narrowing, scanning. Izuku? Something's. He trailed off, frowning, one hand coming up unconsciously to press against his chest, right over the place where the thrum lived. It wasn't reacting to him. That was the strange part. It was reacting to something else, some faint, distant resonance that felt uncomfortably, unmistakably similar to the pressure under his own ribs, like hearing your own voice played back from somewhere far away. I feel something, he said slowly. Like chaos energy, maybe? But wrong. Twisted somehow. It's coming from. He turned, orienting instinctively, and found himself facing the direction of the ruins, the old academy towers just visible over the treeline in the fading light. Belle went very still beside him. That's the same direction Rouge's scan pinged, she said quietly. The signature tales mentioned to your parents. You knew about that already? Rouge mentioned it to me too, a couple days ago. Wasn't sure if I should say anything, wasn't my information to share. She was already scanning the treeline herself now, her optical sensor whirring through some rapid internal calculation, and Izuku watched a familiar tension settle into the set of her shoulders. The same tension that crossed her whenever the word order came up, except sharper now, more present. I don't like this, we should go check it out. Absolutely not. Belle, no. She turned to face him fully, and there was something fierce in her expression now, protective in a way that made Izuku's chest do something complicated. If that's order tech out there, and if it's active enough for both my systems and your, whatever that is you've got going on in your chest, to pick it up from this far away, then it is exactly the kind of situation your parents have spent 15 years trying to keep you clear of. We go tell them. Together. Right now. Izuku wanted to argue. Some old, stubborn part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime being managed, protected, kept carefully out of every conversation that actually mattered to his own life, wanted very badly to march straight toward that pressure in the air and find out, once and for all, what exactly it was that everyone kept so carefully hidden from him. But he looked at Belle's face, at the genuine fear sitting there under the fierceness, and something in him softened instead. Okay, he said. We tell them. Relief flickered across her features, quick and real. Thank you. They turned back toward the village at a brisk pace, the easy warmth of the afternoon replaced now by something tighter, more urgent, both of them glancing back toward the treeline more than once as they walked. Izuku kept one hand pressed to his chest the whole way, monitoring that faint, wrong resonance, and it didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to sharpen, very slightly, the closer evening came, like something out there was waking up. They were 3 streets from Izuku's house when the ground trembled. It wasn't him. He knew immediately, with a certainty that came from 15 years of knowing exactly what his own energy felt like moving through the earth, that this tremor, brief, sharp, gone almost as soon as it started, hadn't come from inside his own chest at all. It had come from somewhere else. Somewhere out past the treeline. Belle's hand found his, gripping tight. That wasn't you, she said, and it wasn't a question. No, Izuku said, his voice gone tight and strange in his own ears. That wasn't me. Overhead, faint against the darkening sky, a thin line of dark smoke had begun to rise from the direction of the ruins. They ran the rest of the way. Izuku made himself keep pace with Belle rather than let instinct carry him ahead at full speed, some old habit of restraint so deeply ingrained it operated almost below conscious thought. But even at a careful, controlled sprint they reached his house in under a minute, bursting through the front door to find it already empty, both his parents' coats gone from their hooks, the kitchen abandoned mid-task with a half-chopped onion still sitting on the cutting board like a small, strange monument to whatever had interrupted dinner prep. "Mom? Dad?" Izuku called, though some part of him already knew the house was empty, could feel it in the particular stillness of the rooms. A note sat on the kitchen table, written in his mother's quick, looping hand. "Izuku, trouble at the ruins, going to check it out with Tails and Rouge. Stay home. We mean it. Back soon. Love you. Mom." He read it twice. Then a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something more permissive if he stared hard enough. "Stay home," he read aloud flatly. Belle, reading over his shoulder, let out a slow breath. "Izuku, they didn't even wait to tell me in person." He set the note down very carefully on the table, aware, distantly, of the low thrum in his chest picking up in response to something that wasn't fear exactly, but ran close alongside it. Something hotter, something that had been building under a lifetime of careful management and porch conversations he wasn't allowed to hear. 15 years, Belle? 15 years of not yet, not ready, we'll tell you when you're older. And the one time something actually happens near our home, they just leave. A note. On the table. "They're trying to protect you," Belle said, but even she didn't sound fully convinced of it anymore, not in the face of that note, not with smoke still visible through the kitchen window rising thin and dark against the evening sky. "From what?" Izuku's voice had gone very quiet, which was, Belle had learned over 2 years of knowing him, far more dangerous than when it rose. "From myself? From whatever's happening out there that apparently has something to do with me, given that I felt it before either of them said a single word to me about it." The floor beneath them gave a faint, answering tremor, not violent, just a small shiver of settling dust from the rafters, but Belle's hand tightened around his instantly, grounding, a silent reminder. Izuku closed his eyes. Breathed. In for 4. The tremor stilled. When he opened his eyes again, something in them had changed, not the panic of a moment before, but something steadier, harder, a decision arriving fully formed the way decisions sometimes do after a lifetime of almost making them. "I'm going out there," he said. "Izuku, not to fight. I'm not stupid, Belle. I know I don't know how to control this thing well enough to walk into an actual fight." His hand found hers again, and this time it was him gripping tight, steadying himself against her rather than the other way around. "But I am done sitting in this house waiting for someone to come home and tell me a carefully edited version of what happened. I want to see it. Whatever it is. With my own eyes, from a safe distance, at least. I want to know, instead of being told what I'm allowed to know." Belle looked at him for a long, searching moment. He could see the calculation happening behind her optical sensor, weighing the fierce protective instinct that wanted to drag him bodily back to his room against something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The same understanding she'd offered him on the ridge just that afternoon, about power and who got to hold it, and why. 15 years of being protected out of every important conversation about his own life. She, of all people, understood exactly what that kind of careful, well-meaning cage felt like from the inside. "Fine," she said finally, and the word came out rough, reluctant, but resolved. "But we go carefully. We stay back. We do not, under any circumstances, walk into the middle of whatever's happening out there. We observe, and if it looks even slightly dangerous, we turn around immediately and I will personally carry you home if I have to. Understood?" "Understood. I mean it, Izuku. I know. Thank you." He squeezed her hand once, hard, and something in his chest, the thrum, the anger, the 15 years of careful management, settled, just slightly, into something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like agency. Like a choice that was actually, finally, his own. They left the house together, the doors swinging shut behind them, and set off toward the ruins under a sky gone the deep bruised purple of full evening, smoke still rising thin against the last light in the west, and neither of them could have known, in that moment, just how much that single choice, to go and see, rather than to stay and wait, was about to change absolutely everything. Behind them, in the abandoned kitchen, the note on the table trembled once, faintly, and went still. The path to the ruins wound up through terraced hillside orchards long gone wild, gnarled apple trees heavy with unpicked fruit casting long strange shadows in the fading light, and Izuku and Belle moved through them quickly and quietly, both of them acutely aware of how loud their own breathing sounded in the sudden hush that had fallen over the whole valley. Even the insects had gone quiet. Even the wind. "That's not normal," Belle murmured, scanning the treeline with her optical sensor cycling rapidly through spectrums. "This kind of silence. Something's suppressing the local wildlife's danger response. Or something's already scared them off. That's not better, Izuku." "I know." They crested the final rise before the ruins proper, and both of them stopped dead, taking in the scene below. The old academy's central courtyard. What remained of it, at least, a wide cracked expanse of ancient stone half swallowed by decades of encroaching moss and ivy, was lit and flickering, unnatural blue-white light, the source of which resolved, as Izuku's eyes adjusted, into a jagged structure rising from the courtyard's center. It looked almost organic in its wrongness, crystalline growths of dark, faceted material bristling upward from a central core that pulsed with slow, arrhythmic light, like something diseased trying to masquerade as a heartbeat. And around it, locked in combat with three figures Izuku recognized instantly even from this distance. The unmistakable blur of his father moving almost too fast to track, his mother's hammer catching the pulsing light in brutal, beautiful arcs, tails weaving overhead in some airborne configuration of his tails Izuku had never actually seen deployed in real combat before. Were shapes that moved wrong, too smooth, too silent, humanoid in outline but clearly not human, not quirk user, not anything natural at all. "Eclipse Order Enforcers," Belle breathed, and her voice had gone very small, very tight. "I've seen the old schematics. My creator documented them, before," she stopped herself. "Those are theirs. That's their tech." Izuku barely heard her. His entire attention had locked onto the crystalline structure at the courtyard's center, because the thrum in his chest, the low, constant pressure he'd spent his entire life learning to contain, had begun, without any conscious effort on his part, to answer it. A pull, sharp and immediate, like a tuning fork finding its matching pitch, his own energy straining toward that pulsing light with an urgency that had nothing to do with choice. "Izuku." Belle's hand was on his arm suddenly, gripping hard, her voice sharpening with alarm. "Izuku, you're glowing." He looked down at his own hands and found her right. A faint green-gold light had begun tracing up along his skin, veins of it, subtle but unmistakable, pulsing in time with the crystalline structure below, and the thrum in his chest had stopped feeling like a held breath and started feeling, for the first time in as long as he could remember, like a door creaking slowly open. "I don't." His voice came out strange, distant, half swallowed by something building underneath it. "I don't think I'm doing this." Below, in the courtyard, his mother's head turned sharply upward, toward the ridge where they stood, and even from this distance Izuku could see her whole body go rigid with a horror that had nothing to do with the enemies surrounding her, and everything to do with the sight of her son, glowing faintly gold-green in the darkness, standing exactly where she told him, in a note on the kitchen table, absolutely not to be. "Izuku!" Her voice carried across the whole valley, raw with a fear he'd heard only once before, in the fragments of memory from a mountain that no longer existed, and the crystalline structure at the courtyard's center, as though responding to the sound of his name, pulsed once, violently, brighter than before, and the ground beneath Izuku's feet began, unmistakably, undeniably, to shake. The ground did not open up. It did not swallow the ridge, or the orchard, or the two figures standing frozen at its crest. What it did was worse, in its own quiet way. It simply shivered, once, deep and slow, like something enormous turning over in its sleep, and in the courtyard below, 3 Order Enforcers all turned their smooth, featureless heads upward at exactly the same moment, toward the ridge, toward the boy glowing faint gold-green in the dark. "Izuku, move!" Belle didn't wait for him to process the words. She grabbed his arm with both hands and hauled hard, dragging him bodily backward off the crest of the hill and down into the cover of the orchard, apple branches whipping past their faces, the sudden absence of open sky feeling, for one disorienting second, like safety. It wasn't. Not really. But it was better than standing in plain sight glowing like a beacon. "They saw us," Izuku said, breathless, the light along his skin still faintly visible even in the tree shadow. guttering now like a candle in wind rather than burning steady. Belle, they saw. I know. Move. She didn't let go of his arm, pulling him further down the slope, weaving between gnarled trunks with a speed that belied her earlier joke about her top speed being an enthusiastic jog. Fear, it turned out, made excellent fuel for even a modest chassis. Behind them, back toward the courtyard, Izuku heard his mother's voice again, sharper now, cutting through the sounds of battle, not calling his name this time, but shouting something at Tails, something he couldn't make out over the pounding of his own pulse. They didn't stop moving until the orchard gave way to the first scattered outbuildings at the edge of the village proper, and even then Belle only slowed rather than stopped, pulling him into the lee of an old grain silo and pressing her back to the corrugated metal, both of them breathing hard, Izuku from real exertion, Belle from some vestigial subroutine that made her simulate breath under stress, a habit she'd once told him she'd never bothered to disable because it made her feel more like a person and less like a machine performing a person's reactions. Are you hurt? She demanded, hands already moving over him in a rapid clinical check, the fierce protectiveness from earlier in the day sharpened now into something almost frantic. Is it still? The glow, is it? It's fading. I think. He looked down at his own hands and found the light there mostly gone now, just the faintest afterimage lingering under his skin like the ghost of a flash photograph. The thrum in his chest hadn't fully quieted though. If anything it had settled into something new, a low, expectant hum that felt less like the wild, formless pressure he'd spent his life containing and more like a key that had just discovered, for the first time, that there was a lock somewhere out there shaped to fit it. I don't understand what happened. I wasn't trying to do anything. I just felt it, and then it was just happening. Resonance, Belle said, and her voice had gone tight and clinical in the way it did when she was frightened and trying very hard not to be, burying the fear under the shape of a working theory. Has to be. Whatever that crystal structure was, it's built from corrupted chaos material. Has to be, given the read both our systems picked up on the walk back from the ridge. And you're, whatever you are, Izuku, you're built from the same fundamental energy at the core of it, even if everything layered on top is different. It's like a tuning fork finding a matching frequency and just ringing, whether you wanted it to or not. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting, it was meant to be true. But she softened almost immediately, seeing his face, and pulled him into a proper embrace instead, arms wrapping around him with a strength that always surprised people who judged her slight frame at face value. You're okay. You're safe. That's the only part that matters right now. He let himself lean into it for a moment, breathing against the faint hum of her internal systems, the particular quiet where that had become, over 2 years, one of the most soothing sounds he knew. Above the village, faint and distant now, he could still hear the sounds of the fight continuing at the ruins. A sharp crack that might have been sonic breaking the sound barrier. The deeper boom that was unmistakably his mother's hammer connecting with something solid. We should get back to the house, Belle said finally, pulling back just enough to look at him properly. Get you somewhere with actual walls between you and that thing, until this settles. I don't like how your energy responded to it. I don't like it at all. Izuku nodded, though something in him, that same stubborn thread that had marched him up to the ridge in the first place, chafed at the idea of simply retreating back into the house to wait, again, for someone else to come home and deliver a carefully filtered version of events. You're doing the thing, Belle said, watching his face. What thing? The thing where you agree out loud and disagree everywhere else. Your jaw does something specific. I've catalogued it, over time. She softened, reaching up to press 2 fingers lightly against the point of his jaw in question, as though she could smooth the tension out of it by touch alone. I'm not saying you don't have a right to be angry about being managed your whole life, Izuku. I'm saying tonight isn't the night to prove a point about it. Whatever that thing in the courtyard is, it wanted you. It got a taste of you. That's not a moment for stubbornness. That's a moment for walls and locked doors and people who love you standing between you and it. I know, he admitted, some of the fight going out of him all at once, leaving him feeling suddenly, thoroughly exhausted. I just hate feeling like the thing everyone's protecting, instead of a person who gets a vote in his own protection. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Belle said gently. You can be both. Tonight, let them have the vote. Tomorrow, once the immediate danger's past, you can fight for a bigger one, and I promise I'll help you fight for it. But not while there's active order tech humming half a mile from your bedroom window. He managed a tired, crooked smile at that, the first real one since the ridge. When did you get so wise? I was built by an engineer who talked to himself constantly while he worked, cataloging every decision out loud like he was narrating a manual nobody would ever read. Some of it stuck, apparently, whether he meant it to or not. They didn't get the chance to discuss it further. A blur of blue crossed the space between the orchard and the silo so fast that Izuku barely registered movement before his father was simply there, crouched in front of him, hands gripping his shoulders, green eyes scanning him head to toe with an intensity Izuku had rarely seen outside of nightmares. Dad, are you hurt? Did it touch you? Did anything touch you? Sonic's voice had none of its usual easy lightness. It came out fast and rough, words tumbling over each other the way they only did when he was truly, deeply afraid. I'm fine. We didn't get close, I promise, we just... You glowed, Izuku. Your mother saw it from the courtyard. I felt the resonance spike from 50 yards out. Do you understand how far that is? Do you understand what that means? He stopped himself, physically reining the words back in, and closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing hard, the same 4-count rhythm he taught his own son a decade ago now clearly being deployed on himself. When he opened them again, some of the raw panic had banked down into something steadier, though no less serious. We're going home. All of us. Right now, is Mom. She's fine. She's finishing up with Tails and Rouge, they'll be right behind us. Sonic's hand found Izuku's shoulder again, gripping tight, and this time Izuku let himself lean into it rather than pull away, some old childhood instinct rising up unbidden. You're safe. I've got you. Let's go home. The walk back to the house, Sonic deliberately, effortfully slow, matching his son's pace rather than sweeping him up and covering the distance in a blink the way some smaller, more frightened part of him clearly wanted to, passed in near total silence. Belle walked close on Izuku's other side, close enough that her hand found his again somewhere around the second street, and neither of them let go until they were through the front door. Amy arrived 20 minutes later, soot-streaked, one sleeve of her jacket singed at the cuff, her hammer slung across her back still humming faintly with residual charge. She crossed the kitchen without a word and pulled Izuku into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked the breath out of him, and he felt her whole body shaking, very slightly, the way it only did in the aftermath of real fear. I'm okay, Mom, he said into her shoulder. I'm okay, I know. Her voice came out thick. I know, sweetheart. I know. She held on a moment longer than strictly necessary before finally pulling back, hands still gripping his shoulders, eyes doing the same fast damage assessment sweep his father's had, though hers lingered longer, more searching, the particular scrutiny of a mother checking not just for physical injury but for something harder to see. Sit down, she said to all of them, gesturing at the kitchen table with the brisk, slightly shaking authority of someone using logistics to keep from falling apart. Everyone. Sit. We're talking about this properly tonight. All of it. Izuku felt something in his chest loosen at those words, not the thrum, but the other thing, the tight coil of 15 years' worth of not yet, not now, you're too young, and he sat down at the table with a kind of cautious, disbelieving hope he hadn't let himself feel in longer than he could remember. Belle hesitated at the edge of the kitchen, one hand on the back of an empty chair, clearly unsure whether this was a conversation she was meant to be part of. Sit, Belle, Amy said, without looking up from the kettle she was filling with hands that still trembled faintly. You're as much a part of this as anyone at this point. Might as well hear it properly instead of through a cracked window. Izuku's head came up sharply. Belle went very still beside him. Amy caught the look on both their faces and, despite everything, managed something that was almost a tired smile. Sweetheart, I'm your mother. I know when a window's been left open a crack. I've known for years. She set the kettle on the stove with a clatter and finally turned to face them both properly, and Izuku saw, under the soot and the exhaustion, something that looked almost like relief, the relief of a burden about to be set down after being carried too long. I should have told you a long time ago anyway. Both of you. I think we've all just been so scared of what happens the day you finally know everything that we kept finding reasons to put it off. And now the day's arrived whether we chose it or not, so... She pulled out a chair and sat, heavily, and looked at her son with an expression that held more nakedness in it than Izuku had seen on her face in years. "Let's talk." Sonic came to sit beside her, his own restless energy for once stilled into something heavy and careful, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all, the kettle beginning its slow climb toward a whistle, the only sound in the room. "I don't know where to start," Amy admitted finally. "Start with what that thing was," Izuku said. "The crystal. In the courtyard." Sonic and Amy exchanged a glance. The old, familiar glance, the one that used to mean how much do we tell him, and then, visibly, deliberately, Sonic seemed to decide something and let that old instinct go. "It's called a resonance anchor," he said. "Old order tech. We've seen versions of it before years ago, back before you were even born, but never one active, never one drawing power the way that one was tonight." His jaw tightened. "It's built to do exactly what it did to you on that ridge, draw out and amplify chaos-based energy in anyone nearby who's carrying enough of it to register. It's not a weapon exactly. It's more like a key, built to find locks. And I'm a lock," Izuku said quietly. "You're the only lock like you in the entire world," Amy said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words, an old grief surfacing that Izuku had felt the edges of his whole life without ever quite being shown the shape of it directly. "That's the truth we've been trying to protect you from having to carry too early, sweetheart. Not because we thought you couldn't handle it, because we were terrified of what it would mean for other people to know it before you were ready to protect yourself." The kettle began to whistle. Nobody moved to take it off the heat for a long moment, until Belle, quietly, got up and did it herself, more out of some deeply ingrained instinct to fix small manageable problems in the face of large unmanageable ones, than any real desire for tea. "Tell me everything," Izuku said. "Please. I mean it. I'm not a kid anymore. I haven't been for a long time, even if you've all needed me to keep being one." Amy closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something in her had settled, some final decision made. "All right," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." The story took the better part of an hour to tell, and Izuku sat through nearly all of it without moving, Belle's hand resting steady against his the entire time, a tea he never drank going cold in front of him. His parents told him about the years before he was born, the long peace after the last great conflict with the old order. A peace built on the assumption that chaos energy in the world had finally settled into something manageable, distributed thin enough across the population's quirks and abilities that no single catastrophic concentration of it could ever occur again. They told him about his own birth, and the moment, vivid still, even 15 years later, in the way both their voices changed when they described it, that the doctors and family gathered around had realized something was different. Something in the newborn boy's tiny body registering readings that shouldn't have been physically possible, a resonance so far beyond anything on record that the instruments meant to measure it had, quite literally, broken. "You weren't born with a quirk in the way most people think of one," Sonic said. "Not exactly. What you were born with is closer to a convergence. My speed, distilled down to something at the very root of what chaos energy even is. Your mother's strength, and more than that, her heart. The specific way her power is always drawn from emotion, from will, rather than pure physical force. And underneath both of those, something older, something that predates either of us, going all the way back to the Chaos Emeralds themselves, to power nobody's fully origin mapped in centuries. All of it, somehow converged. In you. Every measurement anyone's ever taken puts your baseline capacity somewhere beyond what a single Chaos Emerald can produce," Amy said, very quietly. "Not one emerald. Several, working in concert. In a single 15-year-old boy's body." Izuku sat with that for a long moment, feeling it settle into him with a strange, heavy clarity. Not shock, exactly, because some deep, unspoken part of him had always suspected the scale of it, had felt it in every cracked ceiling and every careful, managed conversation his whole life. But hearing it said plainly, in numbers and comparisons rather than careful euphemism, still landed like something physical. "That's why no school would take me," he said. "That's why we wouldn't let any school take you," Sonic corrected, gently but firmly. "UA came to us, actually. Years ago, when you were small. Offered you a spot, conditional on constant containment protocols we weren't willing to put a 5-year-old through. Restraint devices designed for adult combatants. Isolation training. A level of institutional control that felt, to us, less like education and more like, he stopped, jaw working. Like caging something they were afraid of, and calling it a curriculum. We turned them down, Amy said. And every academy after that. Not because we thought you were unteachable, because every single institution that ever expressed interest wanted to teach you the way you'd manage a threat, not the way you'd raise a person. We didn't trust any of them not to make you into a weapon first, and a boy second. Her voice caught. Maybe that was wrong of us. Maybe keeping you home cost you things, friends, structure, a normal kind of growing up, that you deserved to have too. I've lost sleep over that more nights than I can count, but I couldn't hand you over to be trained like a danger to be managed. I couldn't. Izuku felt something loosen in his chest at that. Not forgiveness, not yet, that would take longer to arrive at honestly. But something adjacent to it, the first real understanding of a choice that had shaped his entire life from a perspective other than his own resentment. The mountain, he said, after a moment, forcing the words out even though they still felt, after all these years, like touching a bruise he'd never quite let heal properly. Tell me about the mountain, the real version. Not the bedtime story version I got as a kid. Amy went very still. Sonic reached over and took her hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke. You were too, Amy said finally, her voice gone thin and careful, like she was picking her way across something that might give way beneath her. It was evening, you'd missed your nap, you were overtired and hungry, and I was trying to get dinner on before your father got home, and you just, she stopped, swallowed. You wanted to be picked up, and I was carrying too much to do it right that second, and I said just a minute, sweetheart, the way any parent says to any 2-year-old 100 times a day. And you screamed, just screamed, the way toddlers do except when you scream, the ground listens, Sonic finished, quietly, when Amy couldn't. We didn't even see it happen in real time, not really. 1 second you were red-faced and furious on the kitchen floor, and the next the whole western ridge behind the house had just come apart. Like something had reached up out of the earth and folded it in half. We found out later the shockwave registered on instruments 3 towns over. Was anyone hurt? Izuku asked, very quietly. He'd never actually asked that question before, in 15 years of half-versions and careful edits. He'd never let himself. No, Amy said, and something in her whole body seemed to loosen at finally being able to say it plainly. No, sweetheart. Nobody was hurt. It happened at dusk, the ridge was uninhabited, there was no one out there. You have never once, in your entire life, actually hurt another living person. I need you to hear that clearly, because I don't think you've ever quite let yourself believe it. Izuku sat with that for a long moment, something in his chest, old grief, carried so long he'd stopped recognizing its shape as grief at all, shifting, very slightly, under the weight of finally being told the truth of it plainly. I've spent my whole life being afraid I was a monster who just hadn't gotten the chance to prove it yet, he said, quiet and raw. And you're telling me the worst thing I ever actually did was rearrange some empty rock. You were never a monster, Amy said, fierce now, some of the old guilt in her voice burning away into something closer to conviction. You were a baby who didn't ask for the power he was born with, and 2 parents who got so frightened by the size of what happened that day that we built the rest of your childhood around never letting it happen again, instead of building it around teaching you, early and often, that you were safe, and so was everyone around you, and that fear was never going to be the thing that kept either of those true. And the order, Izuku said, after a long moment, needing to move past the mountain before it swallowed the whole evening whole. Where do they fit into this? Sonic and Amy exchanged another glance, and this one Belle leaned into slightly, her hand tightening almost imperceptibly around Izuku's. The Eclipse Order isn't new, Sonic said. They're older than either of us, going back generations, a shadow society built around one core belief, that chaos energy, properly harvested and concentrated, could tear open passage to something they call the negative zone. A place, or maybe a state, none of the old records agree, where power exists without the normal limits that govern it here. They've tried, over decades, dozens of times, to gather enough concentrated chaos energy to force that passage open. Every attempt's failed. The energy's always been too diffuse, too scattered across too many different sources to actually achieve the density they need. Until you, Amy said very quietly. The moment you were born. And every reading came back the way it did, the Order found out. We don't know how, not exactly. Leaks happen, records get stolen, people talk when they shouldn't. But they found out, and from that day forward, you stopped being a rumor to them and started being a target. A single, living concentration of exactly the kind of power they've spent generations trying and failing to manufacture artificially. The room went very quiet. Izuku became aware, distantly, of Belle's hand gripping his hard enough that if he'd been anyone else it might have hurt. That's why we've kept you hidden, Sonic said. Not from heroes. From them. Every Hero Academy would have meant records, official registration, a paper trail the Order could follow straight to your door. Emerald Hollow doesn't exist on any map for a reason, Izuku. It never has. We built this whole life, this whole village, specifically so that you could grow up somewhere the Order would never think to look. And tonight, they found the ruins anyway, Izuku said slowly, the pieces settling into place with a cold, sick clarity. That resonance anchor. It wasn't random. It was built to draw me out. We don't know that for certain, Amy said, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the denial. It could be coincidence. Old Order tech scavenged by opportunists with no idea what they're sitting on. But you don't believe that. Amy was quiet for a long moment. No, she admitted finally. I don't. The conversation wound down slowly after that, exhaustion finally overtaking the raw urgency of everything that needed saying. And eventually Sonic and Amy retreated to the living room to make hushed calls to Tails and Rouge, coordinating whatever came next, leaving Izuku and Belle alone at the kitchen table with 2 cups of long cold tea and a silence that felt, for the first time all evening, almost peaceful. You okay? Belle asked, eventually. I don't know. Izuku turned his own cup slowly between his hands, watching the pale surface of the tea ripple. It's strange. I spent so long being angry at them for not telling me things, and now that they have, I don't feel relieved, exactly. I just feel like the size of everything got bigger, like I finally understand why the cage was built, but the cage is still a cage. That's fair, Belle said. You're allowed to feel both those things at once. Understanding why someone did something doesn't automatically mean it stops hurting that they did it. He looked at her for a long moment, something in his chest. Not the thrum, the other thing, the warmer thing, pulling tight. How do you always know exactly the right thing to say? I told you earlier. Excellent processing speed. But her mouth curved, faint and genuine, at the corner. Also, for what it's worth, I understand the cage thing better than you might think. My creator built me the same way, in a sense. Hidden. Protected. Kept away from a world he was terrified would either exploit me or destroy me before I understood what I even was. Something crossed her face then, quick and old and painful. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. But it still meant I spent the first stretch of my existence not fully understanding my own history either, being handed pieces of the truth only when someone decided I was ready for them. I didn't know that, Izuku said quietly. About him being like that with you, I don't talk about it much. She looked down at the table, tracing one finger idly along a scratch in the wood grain. He died before he could finish telling me everything. There's gaps, things I still don't know about my own construction, my own purpose, honestly. Whether there was ever meant to be more of me than just this. She gestured vaguely at herself, at the whole shape of her existence. One robot girl, alone in a workshop, piecing together secondhand what her own creator never got the chance to finish explaining. Izuku reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, stilling the restless tracing motion. You're not alone in it anymore, he said. Whatever pieces are missing. We'll figure them out together, if you want to. I mean that. Belle looked up at him, and whatever expression crossed her face in that moment was one Izuku had seen only a handful of times in 2 years of friendship. Something unguarded. Something that looked almost like disbelief that anyone would offer that kind of steadiness without being asked first. You really mean that, she said. Not quite a question. I really mean it. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, very deliberately, turned her hand under his so their fingers laced together properly, and Izuku felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with chaos energy, or resonance, or anything except the simple, uncomplicated warmth of being trusted with something someone else had carried alone for a very long time. Thank you, Belle said quietly. For asking. Most people don't. Most people don't know how much there is to ask about. No, she agreed. They usually don't. Tails arrived not long after, ducking in through the back door with the particular careful quiet of someone who'd already had a long night and didn't especially want to add to the noise of it, and Sonic and Amy pulled him aside into the living room for another round of low, urgent conversation. At this time, at least, nobody bothered to pretend Izuku wasn't allowed to hear the edges of. Belle used the lull to pull a battered notepad from the satchel she carried everywhere, the same one that held half a dozen half-finished schematics at any given time, and began sketching, quick and rough, the shape of something across the page. What are you drawing? Izuku asked, leaning over to look. An idea. She didn't look up, pencil moving in fast, sure lines, a pair of bracer-like forms, articulated at the wrist, lined along the inside with a lattice pattern Izuku didn't recognize. You said the resonance felt like a door creaking open. Like something in you was answering the anchor whether you wanted it to or not. Yeah. What if the answer wasn't don't let the door open at all? That's what everyone's tried your whole life, right? Contain it, hold it shut, never let it move. But you can't hold the door shut forever, Izuku, not against something built specifically to knock. Eventually it gives, and when it gives with no structure behind it, that's when the mountain came down. She tapped the sketch. What if, instead, we build the door a frame? Something that lets the energy move, channels it somewhere useful and controlled instead of just, everywhere, all at once, however it wants. Izuku stared at the rough sketch, something in his chest going very still and very attentive. You think you can build something like that? I think I can try. Belle finally looked up, and there was something bright and fierce in her expression, the particular light she got when a problem had finally handed her something worth solving. I've had 2 years of watching how your energy moves, Izuku. 2 years of patching crack ceilings and reading your face before a flare-up and cataloging every single tell your body gives before it happens. I'm not starting from nothing here. I actually think I might be the single most qualified person on this entire continent to attempt this. And that's not ego, that's just accumulated data. That's very you. To make it sound like a spreadsheet. It's easier to be brave about something when you frame it as a spreadsheet, Belle admitted, quieter now, some of the fierce brightness softening into something more honest. It'll take time, real time, testing, calibration, probably more than a few failures before it works the way I want it to. And I won't pretend there's no risk in it, trying to build something that interfaces directly with power like yours. But I'd rather spend that time building you a frame to move safely inside than spend it watching you white-knuckle a door shut for the rest of your life, waiting for the day it finally gives out from under you. Izuku reached over and closed his hand gently over hers, stilling the pencil. Okay, he said. Let's build it. Something in Belle's face eased, relief and determination both at once, and she turned her hand under his to lace their fingers together over the half-finished sketch. The beginnings of a plan neither of them yet fully understood the shape of, but both of them, for the first time all evening, felt genuinely hopeful about. From the living room, low and urgent, Tails' voice carried faintly through the wall, something about tracking signatures, about how long the Order might have known, about whether Emerald Hollow's long-kept secret had finally, irreversibly, been compromised, but for a few minutes, at the kitchen table, over a rough pencil sketch of something that might one day become a key rather than a cage, neither Izuku nor Belle let it fully reach them. It was well past midnight by the time Belle finally said she should head back to the workshop, and Izuku walked her to the door despite his mother's tired protest from the living room that it was late, and he should be getting to bed himself. I'll be 5 minutes, he called back, and Amy, exhausted and clearly past the point of fighting small battles after the enormity of the evening's larger ones, simply waved a hand in tired acquiescence. Outside, the night had gone clear and cold, stars scattered thick overhead in a sky unmarred by any city's light pollution, the kind of sky Emerald Hollow's isolation afforded that Izuku had never once taken for granted. He and Belle stood together on the porch for a moment, either quite ready to say goodnight. Today was a lot, Izuku said finally. Today was several lots, back to back, with no breaks in between, Belle agreed. You should sleep. Properly, I mean, not the fake sleep you do sometimes where you just lie there running the same thoughts in circles until dawn. You can tell when I do that? I can tell everything, Izuku. It's rather my whole design specification. But she said it gently, teasing rather than clinical, and reached up to brush a strand of unruly green hair back from his forehead in a gesture that mirrored, almost exactly, the one his mother had performed that same morning, in what felt now like an entirely different lifetime. He caught her hand before it fully withdrew, holding it there against the side of his face for a moment, and something passed between them in the quiet dark of the porch that neither of them had quite found words for yet. In 2 years of races through the hills and comfortable workshops, silences and hands finding each other over shared tools without either of them ever quite naming what it meant. Belle, he started, and then stopped, uncertain, the words suddenly too large and too fragile to trust to his own clumsy delivery. I know, she said softly, before he could find them properly. I feel it too. Whatever it is. She hesitated, something vulnerable crossing her expression, the mechanical eye whirring faintly as it focused, unfocused, focused again. I don't know if it's fair to you, to feel this, with someone like me. You have your whole life still ahead of you, Izuku, a whole world of people you haven't even met yet, and Don't, he said, quiet but firm. Don't finish that sentence the way I think you're about to. You're not a lesser option standing in for something better I haven't found yet. You're just you, and I don't want anyone else. I haven't, for a while now, if I'm honest. Belle's hand trembled very slightly under his. That's a lot to put on someone after the day we've had, she said, though there was no real resistance left in her voice, just a kind of overwhelmed wonder trying to find its footing. Maybe, Izuku agreed. But it's true whether I say it tonight, or some easier night that hasn't arrived yet. I'd rather just say it now. While it's true and I'm brave enough to. For a long moment, either of them moved. Then Belle leaned in, slowly, giving him every chance to pull back if this wasn't what he meant, and Izuku met her the rest of the way, and the kiss that followed was soft and careful and entirely unlike anything either of them had experienced before, warm plating meeting warm skin, the faint hum of her systems audible even this close, a physical fact of her that Izuku had never once found strange or off-putting, only simply, uncomplicatedly her. When they finally broke apart, Belle's optical sensor had gone soft and unfocused in a way Izuku had genuinely never seen before. Something like static crackling faintly at the edges of her voice when she finally spoke. Well, she said. That happened, Izuku agreed, grinning despite the exhaustion, despite the enormity of everything the day had held, feeling, for one brief and precious moment, entirely, uncomplicatedly happy. You should still go to bed, Belle said, though she was smiling too, the fierce protectiveness from earlier softened now into something warmer. I know. I will. He didn't let go of her hand yet though, turning it over in his own, tracing the seams of her fingers with an idle, wondering kind of attention. The way you touch something you've just realized you're allowed to touch. Belle? The gauntlets. What you sketched tonight. He looked up, meeting her eyes properly. Thank you? Not just for the idea. For looking at what everyone else has spent my whole life calling a problem, and seeing a system that just needs a better frame instead. Nobody's ever looked at it that way before. Not once. Belle's expression did something complicated and soft. It's what engineers do, Izuku. We don't look at a thing that doesn't work yet and call it broken. We look at it and ask what it's missing. She squeezed his hand. You were never missing anything essential. You were just missing the frame. That's a very different problem to have, and a much more solvable one. I like that, he said quietly. I like that a lot better than the story I've been telling myself. Good. Get used to the new story. I intend to keep telling it to you, loudly and often, until it's the one that sticks. He laughed, soft and real, and pulled her into one more brief embrace before finally, reluctantly, letting her go. Good night, Belle. Good night, Izuku. She lingered a moment longer on the porch steps, then turned to head back down the path toward her workshop, and Izuku watched her go until the darkness swallowed her fully, that same faint, contented warmth still sitting in his chest. He turned to go back inside, and stopped, hand on the door, as something at the edge of his awareness snagged, that same low, expectant hum he'd felt on the ridge earlier that evening stirring faintly again. Distant now, fainter, but unmistakably still present, still active, out there in the dark beyond the tree-line, the resonance anchor. Still humming. Still waiting. He stood on the porch a moment longer, staring out into the dark toward the ruins, feeling that faint pull in his chest like a hell breath he could no longer fully will away, and thought, with a clarity that felt older than his 15 years, that whatever peace tonight had brought, the truth finally told, Belle's hand in his. The warmth of a kiss he'd waited 2 years to be brave enough to offer. None of it changed the fact that somewhere out there in the dark, something built specifically to find him was still, patiently, humming.